The parking ticket was clear: illegal use of handicap parking space. But as Robert Martinez approached Judge Caprio's bench, dragging his right leg and gripping his cane, a mystery began to unfold. Why didn't this clearly disabled man have a handicap permit? The answer would shock everyone in the courtroom. It was a typical Tuesday morning in Providence Municipal Court. Judge Frank Caprio had already seen his share of parking violations, traffic infractions, and the usual parade of everyday people trying to navigate life's complications. The autumn sun filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the wooden benches where defendants waited their turn. But this morning would be different. This morning, Judge Caprio would encounter a case that would test not just his legal judgment, but his faith in the system itself. The court clerk called the next case, Robert Martinez, violation of handicap parking regulations. Citation number 47,829. From the back of the courtroom, a figure slowly rose from his seat. Robert Martinez, 52 years old, was a man whose very appearance told a story of struggle. His graying hair was neatly combed, his clothes clean but showing signs of wear. Most notably, he gripped a wooden walking cane in his right hand, and his left leg dragged slightly as he made his way toward the judge's bench. Every step seemed to require effort. Every movement was deliberate, calculated. The courtroom fell silent as spectators watched this obviously disabled man approach the bench to answer charges of illegally parking in a handicapped space. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Judge Caprio observed the scene with his characteristic mixture of authority and compassion. He'd seen thousands of cases over his decades on the bench, but something about this particular defendant immediately caught his attention. The man's obvious physical limitations made the charges seem almost absurd on their face. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Caprio began, his voice carrying its usual warmth despite the formal setting. "I see you're here about a parking violation. Before we discuss the details, I have to ask, and forgive me for the obvious question, but you appear to have mobility issues. Don't you qualify for a handicap parking permit?" Robert Martinez stood as straight as his condition would allow. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of frustration and exhaustion. "Your Honor, that's exactly the problem. I've been trying to get a permit for 8 months now. 8 months of bureaucracy, paperwork, and appointments that lead nowhere." The judge leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. This wasn't the typical parking violation case. This was something much more complex and potentially much more troubling. "Tell me about this parking incident, Mr. Martinez. What happened on the day you received this citation?" Robert took a deep breath, steadying himself against the defendant's podium. "Your Honor, it was September 15th, a Thursday. I had a doctor's appointment at the medical center downtown. I've been seeing Dr. Patricia Williams there for my condition. I have multiple sclerosis. Your Honor, it's been getting progressively worse over the past 2 years." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and quiet conversations had stopped. Everyone was focused on this man's story. "I drove to the medical center for my appointment," Robert continued, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "But the regular parking spaces were all full. There were 3 handicap spaces available, and I made a decision. I parked in one of them." Judge Caprio nodded slowly. "And you didn't have a handicap permit at the time?" "No, Your Honor. Not for lack of trying, but no." "Explain to me why you don't have a permit, Mr. Martinez. Walk me through what you've been dealing with." Robert's story began to unfold, and it painted a picture of bureaucratic failure that would have been almost comical if it weren't so tragic. He explained how his multiple sclerosis had been diagnosed 2 years earlier, initially with mild symptoms that gradually worsened. His neurologist had recommended he apply for a handicap permit as his mobility decreased. "I went to the DMV in January," Robert explained. "They told me I needed Form DMV-205, which had to be completed by my doctor. So I went to Dr. Williams, and she filled out the form. But when I returned to the DMV, they said the form was outdated. They'd changed the requirements and now needed Form DMV-205A. Judge Caprio's expression grew more serious. He'd heard similar stories before, but the pattern was always disturbing. "So, you got the new form?" "Yes, Your Honor." Dr. Williams was patient with me, and she filled out the new form. But then the DMV said I needed additional documentation, proof of my diagnosis, medical records, and a letter from my neurologist. Not just Dr. Williams, but specifically from my neurologist. The judge shook his head slightly. How long did it take to get that documentation? 3 weeks, Your Honor. My neurologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, had to write a detailed letter explaining my condition, my prognosis, and why I qualified for a handicap permit. She also had to provide copies of my MRI results and other medical records. And then, Robert's voice took on a tone of bitter frustration. Then, I returned to the DMV with everything they'd asked for. But the clerk told me that Dr. Chun's letter wasn't sufficient because she wasn't a certified disability evaluator. They needed me to see a state-approved physician for an independent evaluation. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, clearly processing the absurdity of the situation. Mr. Martinez, you're telling me that despite having multiple sclerosis, despite having medical documentation from 2 different doctors, the state required you to see a 3rd doctor for an independent evaluation. That's correct, Your Honor. And the earliest appointment I could get with a state-approved evaluator was 6 weeks out. This was back in April. So, you waited 6 weeks for this appointment? Yes, Your Honor. I saw Dr. Robert Kim at the State Medical Evaluation Center on May 20th. He spent 15 minutes with me, had me walk across the room, tested my reflexes, and confirmed what my other doctors had already documented, that I have multiple sclerosis and qualify for a handicap permit. And then I had to wait another 2 weeks for Dr. Kim to complete his report and send it to the DMV. When I finally returned to the DMV in early June, they told me there was a problem with Dr. Kim's report. It was missing a specific code number that they needed for their system. Judge Caprio's patience was clearly being tested, not with Robert Martinez, but with the system that had failed him. Let me guess, you had to go back to Dr. Kim to get the code number? Yes, Your Honor. But Dr. Kim was going on vacation, and his office said they couldn't get the corrected report to the DMV until he returned in 3 weeks. The judge was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to process the sheer absurdity of the bureaucratic maze that Robert had been navigating. Mr. Martinez, this is now July, and you still don't have a permit? That's right, Your Honor. When I finally got the corrected report to the DMV in late July, they told me that the original form DMV 205A had expired. It's only valid for 6 months, and mine was dated January. Had to start the whole process over again. There was an audible gasp from the courtroom gallery. Even the court reporter looked up from her machine with an expression of disbelief. You had to start over? Judge Caprio asked, his voice carrying a note of incredulity. Yes, Your Honor. Back to Dr. Williams for a new form, back to Dr. Chen for updated medical records, and back to Dr. Kim for another evaluation. But this time, Dr. Kim's office said they couldn't see me until September because they were backlogged with other state evaluations. So, you were stuck in this bureaucratic loop for 8 months. Yes, Your Honor. 8 months of appointments, paperwork, waiting, and more waiting. And during this time, my condition continued to get worse. Walking became more difficult. Some days I can barely make it from my car to the building entrance. Judge Caprio looked directly at Robert Martinez, and his expression softened with genuine compassion. Mr. Martinez, tell me about the day you received this parking citation. What were the circumstances? Robert's voice became quieter, more personal. Your Honor, September 15th was a particularly bad day for me. I'd been having what my doctor calls a flare-up. My symptoms were worse than usual. My balance was off, my left leg was almost completely numb, and I was having trouble with my coordination. But you still drove to your appointment? I had to, Your Honor. This was an important appointment with Dr. Williams. We were discussing changing my medication. Because the current treatment wasn't working as well as it used to, I couldn't afford to miss this appointment. And when you arrived at the medical center, the parking lot was completely full. Your Honor, I drove around for 15 minutes looking for a space. I was already 10 minutes late for my appointment, and I was getting more frustrated and exhausted with each passing minute. Judge Caprio nodded, clearly understanding the impossible situation Robert had found himself in. Finally, I saw that there were 3 handicap spaces available. I sat in my car for several minutes, debating what to do. I knew I didn't have a permit, but I also knew that I genuinely needed that space. My condition makes it almost impossible for me to walk long distances, so you made the decision to park there. Yes, Your Honor. I parked in the handicap space and put a note on my dashboard explaining that I was disabled, and in the process of getting a permit, I included my doctor's name and phone number, hoping that if a parking officer saw it, they might understand the situation, but you still received a citation. Yes, Your Honor. When I came out of my appointment an hour later, there was a $150 parking ticket on my windshield. The officer had apparently ignored my note completely. Judge Caprio was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing everything he'd heard. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for his response. Mr. Martinez, I have to ask, have you finally received your handicap permit? Robert's face showed a mixture of relief and continued frustration. Yes, Your Honor. I finally received it last week. It took exactly 8 months and 17 days from my first application to actually getting the permit in my hands. And how do you feel about this whole experience? Honestly, Your Honor, I feel failed by the system. I understand that there need to be procedures in place to prevent abuse of handicap parking, but when someone with a legitimate disability has to jump through hoops for 8 months while their condition gets worse, something is fundamentally wrong. Judge Caprio leaned forward, his expression serious but compassionate. Mr. Martinez, I want you to know that I've been listening carefully to your story. And I have to say that what you've described is not just bureaucratic incompetence, it's a form of systemic discrimination against people with disabilities. Thank you, Your Honor. That's exactly how it felt. The law is supposed to protect people like you, not punish them. The fact that you had to navigate this maze of paperwork and appointments while dealing with a progressive neurological condition is absolutely unacceptable. Robert nodded, clearly moved by the judge's understanding and validation. Now, about this parking citation, Judge Caprio continued. Technically, you did park in a handicap space without a permit. That's a violation of the law. However, the circumstances of your case are extraordinary, and I believe that justice requires us to look beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. The courtroom was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. Mr. Martinez, the purpose of handicap parking laws is to ensure that people with disabilities have access to the services and facilities they need. In your case, the very system that was supposed to provide you with that access failed you completely. Judge Caprio paused, looking directly at Robert. I'm going to dismiss this citation. Mr. Martinez, not because you didn't park in a handicap space without a permit, you did, but because requiring you to pay a fine for seeking medical care while disabled and struggling with bureaucratic failure would be a fundamental miscarriage of justice. Robert's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, Your Honor, thank you so much. But I'm not finished, Judge Caprio continued. I'm also going to do something else. I'm going to write a letter to the Department of Motor Vehicles, documenting your experience and recommending that they review their procedures for issuing handicap permits. What happened to you should never happen to anyone else. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause. Even the court officers seemed moved by the judge's decision and his commitment to addressing the systemic issues that had caused Robert's ordeal. Furthermore, Judge Caprio added, I'm going to ask my clerk to provide you with information about disability rights organizations that might be able to help you, and others who have faced similar challenges. Your experience shouldn't be in vain, it should be a catalyst for change. Robert Martinez stood as straight as his condition would allow, tears streaming down his face. Your Honor, I never expected this kind of understanding and support. I thought I was just going to pay a fine and move on with my life. Justice isn't just about following rules, Mr. Martinez. It's about doing what's right, especially for those who need protection most. You came here today as a disabled man who made a difficult choice in an impossible situation. You're leaving here as an advocate for everyone who faces similar challenges. Judge Caprio's voice became more formal as he concluded the case. Citation number 47,829 is hereby dismissed. The court finds that the defendant's violation was the result of systemic failure rather than willful disregard for the law. Mr. Martinez, you're free to go, and I hope your health improves. As Robert Martinez slowly made his way out of the courtroom, using his cane and dragging his left leg, the courtroom remained silent. But it wasn't the silence of discomfort or pity, it was the silence of respect and recognition. Judge Caprio watched him go, then turned to his clerk. Please make sure that letter to the DMV gets written today. And see if you can find out if there are other cases like this one that we should be aware of. The next case was called, and the court session continued. But for everyone who witnessed Robert Martinez's story, the morning had been about more than just parking violations and legal procedures. It had been about the fundamental human dignity that should be at the heart of every legal system. In the weeks that followed, Judge Caprio's letter to the DMV would indeed lead to policy changes that streamlined the handicap permit process. Robert Martinez's 8-month ordeal would help ensure that future applicants wouldn't face the same bureaucratic nightmare. But perhaps most importantly, Robert's story became a reminder that behind every citation, every violation, and every legal proceeding is a human being with their own struggles, challenges, and dignity. And sometimes, the most important thing a judge can do is recognize that humanity and respond with compassion. Judge Frank Caprio had seen thousands of cases over his career. But Robert Martinez's story would stay with him as an example of why justice must always be tempered with mercy, and why the law must serve the people, not the other way around. The parking ticket that brought Robert Martinez to court that day was worth $150, but the lesson in human dignity and systemic justice that resulted from his case was priceless. As we reflect on Robert Martinez's story, we're reminded that the legal system at its best doesn't just enforce rules, it protects the vulnerable and ensures that justice serves humanity. Judge Caprio's decision to dismiss the citation wasn't just about one man's parking violation. It was about recognizing that sometimes the system fails, and when it does, our response defines who we are as a society. Robert Martinez came to court that day expecting to pay a fine. Instead, he became an advocate for change, and his story became a catalyst for reform. That's the power of compassionate justice. It doesn't just resolve individual cases, it makes the system better for everyone. In Providence Municipal Court, Judge Frank Caprio continues to demonstrate that justice and mercy aren't opposites, they're partners in the pursuit of a more humane legal system. And stories like Robert Martinez's remind us why that partnership is so essential. As we reflect on Robert Martinez's story, we're reminded that the legal system at its best doesn't just enforce rules, it protects the vulnerable and ensures that justice serves humanity. Judge Caprio's decision to dismiss the citation wasn't just about one man's parking violation. It was about recognizing that sometimes the system fails, and when it does, our response defines who we are as a society.